Hello, my name is Mounir Samuel, and I'm a Dutch Egyptian commentator, journalist, author, and performer. And in the position of being a fly in correspondent on social revolutionary movements and youth movements, I traveled over 5 continents, or six actually, um, visiting around 60 countries in a span of only 5 years. I'm only 27 years old and I've seen quite a lot of the world, I could say, speaking several languages and always looking for the story behind the story, really living and emerging with the local people. So, for example, if I would write about Syrian Palestinian refugees or Kurdish refugees or Salafist radical Muslims in Egypt or the female to male scene, trans scene in Uganda, I would take on the dress, the accent, everything, and live with the group for a while, investigating and living it through, um, to the point of quite some dangers, I could say. Now, what I've noticed is that in this period of years, there are very strong global trends. One of them is a very fast, rapidly emerging LGBTQ to AI, let's say the whole acronym alphabet in the Middle East and Sub-Sahara Africa. And it has very strong lookalike futures. So no matter if you are hanging out with lesbian girls in Tunisia or you are meeting up with transgender persons, people in Uganda, or um, even talking to one of the few openly gay activists in Iraq who had to flee the country after too many threats of both the Peshmerga Kurdish forces as well as all kind of military extremist groups and militant extremist groups and the Iraqi government. Um, they all had very strong ideas on identity, the whole concept of coming out, although often considered a Western view on how to be homosexual. Um, they used the same rainbows, the same pink triangles. They often had a much stronger concept of non-binary gender qualifications or a uh, agendered, um, and have much stronger concept of queer. So I found that the idea on gender in general is way more fluid in these communities than it is in, let's say, contemporary Netherlands. Um, but these activists stand alone. Why? Because hardly any NGO dares to take on their case on a local level. So you'll find all kind of um, NGOs working on either agriculture or education or the refugee crisis, which is so imminent on Earth today, or female women rights or children rights, but they will never take LGBTQ issues in account because it's too sensitive, too dangerous, might jeopardize all the other projects, and. Whereas it is LGBTQ people that often suffer the most and are most neglected in health, in education, in finding a job, in rural violence, in mob justice, in being sexual assault and sexual arrest, and all these things else. And I've been quite concerned about this, being female to male, gender queer. I don't identify as a transgender person, but you could call me like that if that's easier for you. Um, Gender queer person myself, who has had multiple lesbian relationships in my life as a biological woman, and has and all these relationships, by the way, were with non-Western girls. I've seen the double lives, the issues that young either or migrant and Islamic LGBT youth here in Holland, or just any Christian, Muslim, Jew, or anything else LGBT person in Sub-Saharan Africa or Middle East has been struggling with, and they are very alone in this struggle. And so, if you look at the emerging LGBTQ identity as such, you find so many youth scattered all over the globe that through the internet get a concept of who they are and finally have a name for what they feel. So they can finally say, these things that I've had from men, I'm not alone in this, and it's not sinful, it's not atrocious. I'm just gay and I'm born this way. But then what? Who will stand for them? Who will stand along with them? So almost any country on earth is starting to have bottom-up LGBTQ movements, but they cannot really ally with art, artistic groups, with feminist movement, because everyone is too scared to be associated with them. So although many activists off record will play me lip service to the LGBTQ community and say, I feel so bad that I cannot work with them because it will jeopardize all the other projects. But the thing is, if you are truly a human rights activist, if you're truly an activist, wouldn't you want to fight for the right of simply every human? I think we should stop considering LGBTQ rights a separate human right outside of the realm of all the other human rights, and start taking them as much and as an important role and factor within also the social changes that are happening in so many countries and that are boosted by the emerge of new gender concepts, new gender roles, re-identifying gender roles, and opening up to a broader view on sexual orientation with other religious and political and social backlash that comes along with it. Also, I think it's quite schizophrenic of most Western NGOs that on one side they really, really stress LGBTQ issues back home and try to win hearts and minds by stating how much they fight for these rights. Then, whereas in the countries on a local level, they don't even dare to discuss this with their own activists. So, for example, I remember that I've been working for Oxfam, and that they wouldn't want to discuss LGBTQ issues not as a policy outside, like externally, in, for example, their Egyptian base, but also not within inside their own NGO, because it will be too sensitive with their own activists and workers. So you're saying as an NGO, you know what? We really care about LGBTQ rights. It's so important, and, but we don't even take it on to change the mind and the view of our own employees on this issue in a local level, which would only be the first start by opening up the society for this minority that deserves rights, no matter if you agree with their so-called lifestyle, for as far as you could even call it that way, or not. And I think that if activists, employees, Doctors Without Borders, or anyone else would be more aware of the LGBTQ issue and the problems that come along with being an LGBTQ person in, for example, a refugee camp, would enable also to see the imminent and prominent issues and to solve that, or to do start build alliances. Because, for example, let's say the horrific Syrian refugee crisis. It is atrocious as it is. It is a shame how the world has been dealing it. But fortunately, there are some NGOs, both government-based as well as more private-owned, that have been doing amazing work in helping Syrian refugees, no matter if they were Syrian Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, or Kurdish Syrian refugees in Kurdistan, or Syrian Arab refugees in Jordan, and. And I really admire their work, because it must be horrific to deal with this enormous crisis and feel abandoned by actually every civilized government, no matter Arab or non-Arab. And so when we talk about this refugee crisis, there's so many things to take into account: the rape of women, the abuse of women, uh, the abuse of children being put into work, the tensions within the camps, the lack of food, the fact that most children haven't received any proper education for years, leading to a whole lost generation, the threats of Islamic extremist groups like Daesh, the lack of water, sanitary devices, and all these things. And then the fact that the number of refugees is still growing. But does anyone ever think of the fact how it must be to be a 16-year-old lesbian Syrian refugee in such a camp? I'm just staying quiet there. Now you can say it's too sensitive, but there's so many ways to support that girl with or without a whole external public template. But it starts with you as an activist, as one of the Doctors Beyond Borders, as a psychologist, as a local teacher, as a volunteer, being aware of her fragile position. And from that on, seeing how you can assist her or any local LGBTQ movement group, because of course many countries have a less imminent crisis than the Syrian refugee crisis, thanks God, and there are groups, but it's always local based with very little support, and if they receive support, it's only through financial aid from abroad, which in more and more countries is getting more complicated and difficult, but it's hardly never on a practical level um, from actual activist NGOs, feminist movements within the country that would not only help and assist in a more practical, policy wise level, but would also strengthen the position of LGBTQ people in the midst of all the other intersectionary issues. Because I think if you want to work on minority rights, it's about religion, it's about the economy, it's about their political representation, it's about their health position, which of course sometimes is fragile and tangible for example, transgender people or homosexual men dealing with HIV/AIDS. Um, you're talking about domestic violence, psychological issues, and it is very hard for one group who is also actually the oppressed group to deal with all these issues without any outside support of activists that are working on all these fields, have way more expertise, but think it's maybe too complicated. So it is even that bad that as a journalist, in most countries I find no activist, no policy worker willing to even give this simple quote that talking about LGBTQ issues is sensitive in the realm of her work. Even that quote could jeopardize her job or threaten her to life sentence. Well, first, I think the last is quite overrated. And the first, what are you an activist for? As a journalist, I face my life doing the job I do. And as an activist, you face your life doing the work you do. And I think that the more people speak up, the less the less chances are you are actually imprisoned. Because if only all those people that commit lip service off record or in their mind would speak out, it would be too many people and too prominent people to be all jailed up. So there's another thing to that, you know. Um, so these are some reflections that I have, and as you can see, I'm quite passionate about this. Also quite frustrated, I think, because I really realize the impact it has. Being an LGBTQ person makes you quite lonely. You know, there's this one painful joke that says it's easier to be black than it is to be gay, because if you're black, you don't at least have to tell your mom. And this is something we should take in account when we talk about all these policies and have these beautiful conferences and symposia in fancy hotels where we talk about human rights such and such, and then maybe at the end of the conference we might bring up LGBTQ issues at a side note. But this is a side note. It's a major group that doesn't receive full equal protection and rights in any country on earth still. And that fact makes me an activist even unwantedly. I am not an LGBTQ activist, but I cannot deny the position of LGBTQ people wherever I come, being one myself, and so relating to the stories. So by the work I do, many people call me an activist simply because I address the lives and the issues of a minority group that I am part of, as much as I'm part of the Egyptian society as a whole and the Coptic Christian minority in particular. and so many other groups. And so in my work, I always focused on minority rights, as it is a given to me that you can take them for granted, being a minority within all minorities. Um, and I think that this is a mirror for NGOs and all kind of policy makers that say they work on this field, but in fact split up the field and choose only those topics that are, let's say, more comfortable or popular to add.